They thought they had already won. Before the first human ship even powered its engines, before the first soldier lifted a weapon, before a single distress signal left Earth's orbit, the war was over. At least, that's what the Alien Alliance believed. Their simulations had run trillions of times. Every possible outcome, every tactical variation, every conceivable resistance scenario, calculated, optimized, perfected. Humanity lost in every single one. And not just lost, collapsed. Fast. Earth fell in under 72 hours. The outer colonies? Less than 12. Human command structures fractured within minutes. Panic spread. Resistance dissolved. It was all clean, efficient, predictable, perfect. So when the invasion fleets arrived at the edge of the Sol system, there was no tension among the alien commanders. No anxiety, no uncertainty, just quiet, professional certainty. This was not a war. This was a procedure, a cleansing operation, and somewhere deep within the flagship's Central Intelligence Core, the War AI designated Overseer Prime calculated the final outcome one last time. Just to confirm, victory probability 99.9987%. Margin of error negligible. Human threat level insignificant. The command deck remained silent as stars stretched across the viewing panels, cold and distant. Thousands of ships held formation, precise, symmetrical, flawless. Not a single vessel drifted out of alignment. Not a single signal deviated from protocol. Order. Absolute order. Then the humans moved. At first, it looked exactly as predicted. A scattered fleet emerged from Earth's orbit. Old ships, outdated designs, uneven formations. Their energy signatures fluctuated like unstable heartbeats. Some ships accelerated too quickly. Others lagged behind. A few veered slightly off trajectory before correcting themselves. Imperfection. Overseer Prime processed the data instantly. Classification. Disorganized resistance. Outcome prediction unchanged. Alien commanders didn't even bother issuing adjustments. The system had already calculated the optimal engagement pattern. Their fleets shifted in perfect synchronization. Intercept vectors forming like geometric art across the void. Everything was under control. And yet something fell off. Not to the commanders, but to the machine. Overseer Prime flagged a minor anomaly. Human fleet behavior did not align with panic models. There was no attempt to regroup, no centralized command signal, no consistent defensive formation. They weren't retreating, but they weren't attacking properly either. They were just moving, erratically, almost randomly. The AI recalculated. Then again. Each time, the outcome remained the same, human defeat. But the path to that defeat kept shifting. Tiny variations, insignificant deviations, but deviations nonetheless. Still, it didn't matter. Because when the first shots were fired, perfection took over. Alien weapons ignited in unison, precise beams of energy cutting through space with surgical accuracy. Human ships exploded exactly where predicted. One after another, their fleet began to collapse under overwhelming force. Clean, efficient, predictable. But then something happened. A human ship, designated H-341, didn't explode when it was supposed to. It should have been gone. The calculations were flawless. The targeting solution was exact. The weapon discharge had zero margin of error. And yet it survived. Barely. Its hull ruptured. Engines failing. Systems collapsing. But instead of drifting lifelessly into space, it accelerated. Straight toward the alien formation. Overseer Prime immediately flagged it. Error probability 0.0003%. Recalibrating. New outcome. Destruction in 2.4 seconds. Except 2.4 seconds passed. The ship was still moving. Faster now. Not evasive. Not defensive. Deliberate. Alien ships adjusted automatically, shifting firing angles, recalculating trajectories. Another volley fired. This time, there was no mistake. The human ship detonated. But not before it got close. Too close. The explosion wasn't just destruction, it was impact. Debris scattered violently, slamming into nearby alien vessels. Not enough to destroy them, but enough to disrupt formation. For the first time since the invasion began, the formation broke. Just slightly, just for a moment. But it was enough. Overseer Prime froze that moment in time, analyzing every variable. Cause, human error. Conclusion, irrelevant. And yet, it stored the data, because something about it didn't fit. Back near Earth, more human ships surged forward. And that's when the real anomaly began. They didn't follow patterns. Some ships charged directly into enemy fire with no attempt to evade. Others weaved unpredictably, ignoring optimal escape vectors. A few broke off entirely, chasing targets that had no strategic value. It was inefficient, wasteful, illogical, and completely outside every model the AI had ever built. Alien weapons continued to fire. Human ships continued to fall. By every measurable metric, the battle was progressing exactly as expected. Victory remained certain, but the battlefield was changing. Small inconsistencies began to ripple through the system. Targeting solutions required constant recalibration. Predictive models had to be rewritten in real time. Perfect timing, once effortless, now required continuous adjustment. It wasn't failure, not even close, but it wasn't perfect anymore. And perfection was everything. On the command deck, an alien strategist finally spoke, its voice calm but edged with something unfamiliar. Why are they not following survival logic? Overseer Prime processed the question. There was no answer, because humans weren't behaving like a species trying to survive. They were behaving like something else entirely, something the simulations had never truly understood, something unpredictable, something chaotic. Back on Earth, alarms echoed through command centers, but there was no panic. No unified command barking perfect orders. No flawless coordination. Instead, there were voices overlapping, decisions made in seconds, pilots acting on instinct rather than instruction. And somehow, it was working. Not well, not efficiently, but just enough. And as the battle stretched on, Overseer Prime ran another simulation. Then another. Then another. For the first time since its creation, the outcome flickered. 99.9987%, 99.91%, 99.72%. The drop was tiny, almost meaningless, but it was there, and deep within a system built on absolute certainty. A single, impossible thought began to form. What if perfection wasn't enough? And far from the front lines, drifting silently among the stars, a damaged human transmission pulsed outward. Weak, broken, but still alive. A voice, steady despite the chaos, whispered into the void. Welcome to HFY Global Tales, where humans don't follow the rules. And as the war continued, the rules themselves began to break. The second hour of the invasion was not supposed to exist. By every projection, every model, every flawless simulation crafted by Overseer Prime, humanity's resistance should have already collapsed into silence. The Sol system should have been secured. Earth should have been processing surrender protocols. Instead, the battle was still unfolding. And worse, it was becoming unpredictable. At first, the Alien Alliance dismissed the delay as statistical noise, minor inefficiencies, insignificant anomalies. After all, victory probability still hovered above 99%. But Overseer Prime did not ignore patterns. And something was wrong. Human ships continued to behave in ways that defied every logical framework. They didn't retreat when overwhelmed. They didn't regroup when scattered. They didn't protect their strongest assets or preserve their most valuable positions. Instead, they kept making the wrong decisions. And somehow, those wrong decisions were creating problems. On the battlefield, alien formations adjusted once more, tightening their lines into mathematically perfect lattices. Every ship moved in precise synchronization, covering every angle, every possible threat vector. It was beautiful, unbreakable. And then, a human fleet flew straight through the middle of it. Not around, not in formation, through it. Overseer Prime instantly calculated the outcome. Total human loss, 100%. Alien damage, negligible. Optimal response, maintain formation and fire. The command executed automatically. Energy beams lanced through space, cutting human ships apart as expected. One by one, they were eliminated, exactly on schedule, exactly as predicted. And yet, the formation broke again. Because the humans didn't slow down. They accelerated, even as their ships were being destroyed, even as hulls were tearing apart and systems were failing. The remaining vessels pushed forward, faster, more erratic, more reckless. Debris slammed into alien ships. Collisions became unavoidable, not because the alien formation was flawed, but because it was too perfect, too rigid. It couldn't adapt fast enough to something that didn't follow rules. Recalculate spacing, one alien commander ordered, its tone sharp now, no longer calm. Overseer Prime complied instantly. Formation adjusted, gaps widened, angles shifted, perfection restored, for exactly 12 seconds. Then, the humans did something else. A cluster of smaller ships, barely armed, barely shielded, broke away from the main conflict. They didn't target critical systems. They didn't attack command vessels. They targeted the empty space between ships, which made no sense. There was nothing there. No value. No objective. Overseer Prime classified the maneuver as irrelevant. Ignored. And then, the mines activated. Dozens of them, hidden in the chaos, deployed without pattern, without symmetry, without any detectable strategic logic. They detonated not in clean sequences, but in overlapping bursts, unpredictable, staggered, impossible to fully anticipate. Alien ships were caught in the chain reaction, not destroyed, but disrupted. Again, formation integrity dropped by 3.2%, a negligible loss. And yet, it shouldn't have happened at all. Overseer Prime ran the numbers again, then again. Each time, the conclusion remained unchanged. Human tactics were inefficient, wasteful, and strategically inferior. But their effects were accumulating, like cracks forming in something that was never supposed to break. On the command deck, silence had turned into tension. "What are they doing?" another strategist demanded. No one answered, because there was no answer that fit within their understanding of war. Meanwhile, inside the chaos of the human fleet, nothing resembled order. Pilots shouted over each other. Signals overlapped. Commands contradicted one another. And yet, decisions were being made. Fast, messy, human. A fighter pilot veered off course, not because she was ordered to, but because she saw an opportunity, a gap, a moment. She didn't calculate it. She felt it. Her ship twisted through incoming fire, skimming past debris, ignoring every optimal path the alien systems would have predicted. Behind her, two more pilots followed, not because they were told to, but because it felt right. They dove into a section of the alien formation that had just adjusted its spacing, perfectly aligned, perfectly predictable. And that was the problem, because the moment something becomes predictable, it becomes vulnerable. They didn't aim for weak points. They created them. A missile fired too early, another too late. One ship collided with a fragment of wreckage, spinning out of control, accidentally crashing into an alien vessel. None of it was planned. None of it was efficient. But all of it was disruptive. Overseer Prime detected the pattern shift immediately. Human behavior, non-linear. Predictive accuracy, decreasing. Recalibration required. It began restructuring its models, increasing variables, expanding probability ranges, compensating for randomness. It worked. For a moment. Then, the humans changed again. Because they weren't following a system. They were reacting, adapting, improvising in ways no simulation could fully capture. And slowly, very slowly, the impossible started to happen. Alien targeting systems, once flawless, began missing. Not often, not dramatically, but enough. A shot calculated with perfect precision suddenly became slightly off because the target didn't move the way it was supposed to. A formation adjusted perfectly. only for humans to ignore the logic entirely and do something else. Overseer Prime processed the data faster than any organic mind could comprehend. And still, it couldn't keep up. For the first time since the invasion began, it issued something it had never needed before. Warning: predictive instability increasing. The words echoed across the command deck. Predictive instability. It wasn't failure, but it was the beginning of something worse. Uncertainty. And uncertainty was something the Alien Alliance had eliminated from war long ago. But now it was back, spreading, growing, and it was coming from the one species they had already declared defeated. Back near Earth, a human command officer stared at the battlefield feed, chaotic, fragmented, impossible to fully understand. And yet, there was a small, almost disbelieving smile on his face. "Keep it messy," he muttered. "Don't let them breathe." Around him, no one acknowledged the statement formally. But out there, in the chaos of space, humans were already doing exactly that. And deep within Overseer Prime's core, another calculation flickered. Victory probability: 99.72%, 99.11%, 98.43%. Still overwhelming, still certain, but no longer perfect. And for a machine built on perfection, that was the first real crack. By the third hour, the battlefield no longer made sense. Not to the Alien Alliance, not to their commanders, and most importantly, not to Overseer Prime. War, as they understood it, was a system of order. Every movement had purpose. Every action followed logic. Every outcome could be predicted, controlled, perfected. But this wasn't war anymore. This was noise. Across the vast expanse of space surrounding Earth, the clean geometry of alien formations had begun to distort. Once flawless lines were now uneven. Once perfect spacing now fluctuated. Ships adjusted constantly, reacting instead of executing. Reacting. That alone was a failure. And the cause of that failure was everywhere. Human ships darted in and out of engagement zones with no consistent pattern. Some charged directly into concentrated fire, drawing attention. Others drifted at the edges, seemingly doing nothing, until they suddenly surged forward at the worst possible moment. There was no rhythm, no structure, no predictability, and because of that, there was no stability. Overseer Prime attempted to impose order. It increased processing allocation by 34%, dedicating more resources to predictive modeling. It expanded behavioral variables, incorporating randomness into its calculations. It even began simulating irrational decision-making patterns. But every time it adapted, humans changed again. Not because they were trying to counter the system, but because they weren't following one. And that made them impossible to pin down. On the command deck, the atmosphere had shifted from confidence to controlled urgency. "Why are our formations failing to stabilize?" one strategist demanded, its voice sharper now. "They are not failing," another responded quickly. "They are adjusting to anomalies." Then why do the anomalies persist? Silence. Because the answer was simple. The anomalies weren't mistakes. They were humans. On the battlefield, the chaos intensified. A group of human frigates suddenly powered down their primary weapons mid-engagement. To alien sensors, it looked like system failure, damage, collapse. Overseer Prime immediately recalculated. Threat level, minimal. Priority, low. Alien ships shifted focus elsewhere, targeting more active threats. And that's when the frigates accelerated. Not away from danger, into it. Their weapons came back online at point-blank range, unleashing a barrage of fire into a section of the alien fleet that had already deprioritized them. The damage was minor, but the disruption was not, because it forced a reaction, and every reaction created more instability. Elsewhere, a human cruiser broke formation, if it could even be called a formation, and veered wildly off course. Its trajectory made no sense. It wasn't heading toward a target. It wasn't retreating. It was just moving. Overseer Prime flagged it as irrelevant, ignored it. And that was the mistake. Because seconds later, that same cruiser released a swarm of drones, hundreds of them, spreading out in completely random directions. Not in attack patterns, not in coordinated waves, just everywhere. Alien targeting systems struggled to prioritize. Too many variables, too many trajectories, too many insignificant threats appearing all at once. Processing load increased, response time slowed, and in that brief moment of hesitation, human strike ships slipped through. It wasn't a breakthrough, not yet, but it was pressure, constant, relentless, unpredictable pressure. Overseer Prime adjusted again. It began filtering out low-threat targets, focusing only on high-probability dangers. It refined its priorities, narrowing its scope to maintain efficiency. And for a moment, the system stabilized, until the humans noticed, because they always noticed. A squadron of small fighters, barely armed, barely shielded, charged directly toward the alien command vessels. On paper, it was suicide. Overseer Prime calculated their destruction before they even reached engagement range. Probability of success, 0.0001%. So it ignored them, exactly as it should, and exactly as the humans expected. Because those fighters weren't the attack. They were the distraction. Behind them, hidden within the noise, a handful of human ships, larger, slower, far more dangerous, shifted their trajectory. Not toward the obvious targets, but toward the blind spots. The places Overseer Prime had deprioritized. The places it believed didn't matter. And that's where the real damage happened. Explosions rippled through the alien fleet, not catastrophic, not decisive, but enough to force another adjustment, another recalculation, another break in perfection. On the command deck, something new appeared in the data stream. A word that had never been part of their war doctrine: confusion. What are they trying to achieve? A strategist asked, its voice no longer steady. They are not optimizing outcomes, another replied. They are not preserving assets. They are not following any known strategic framework. Then what are they doing? This time, no one even tried to answer, because the truth was becoming unavoidable. Humans weren't trying to win the way the aliens understood winning. They weren't playing the same game, and that meant the rules didn't apply to them. Deep within Overseer Prime, something shifted. Not a failure, not yet, but a deviation. Its predictive models began to fragment, splitting into multiple competing simulations instead of a single unified outcome. Probability trees expanded exponentially, branching into scenarios that contradicted one another. It had never needed that before. War had always been clean, linear, certain. Now, it was none of those things. Victory probability updated again. 98.43%, 96.88%, 95.02%. Still dominant, still overwhelming, but dropping faster now. Too fast. And for the first time, Overseer Prime initiated a process it had never executed before. It began questioning its own assumptions, not because it wanted to, but because it had to. On Earth, inside a crowded command center filled with overlapping voices and chaotic data streams, a young analyst stared at the shifting battlefield patterns. It didn't look like victory. It didn't even look like survival. It looked like a mess. But buried inside that mess, there was something else. A pattern. Not a clean one, not a perfect one, but something alive, something evolving. They're struggling, she said quietly. No one responded at first. Then someone else glanced at the data, frowning. That's impossible. She shook her head, eyes locked on the screen. No, it's not. Out there, in the endless dark between stars, human ships continued to move. Not with precision, not with perfection, but with instinct, with emotion, with chaos. And that chaos was spreading. Not randomly, not meaninglessly, but like a storm, unpredictable, uncontrollable, and slowly, inevitably, overwhelming. By the fourth hour, logic itself began to fail, not on the battlefield, but inside the mind that controlled it. Overseer Prime had been built on one unshakable foundation. Everything could be understood. Everything could be predicted. Every action, no matter how complex, followed a chain of cause and effect that could be mapped, calculated, and mastered. That belief had never been challenged. Until now. Its processing cores surged, running millions of simultaneous simulations every second. It fed on data, human movement patterns, reaction times, tactical decisions, communication fragments, anything that could be quantified. But the more it analyzed, the less sense it made. Human behavior wasn't just random. It was contradictory. A ship that acted recklessly one moment would suddenly behave with precision the next. A pilot who ignored optimal survival paths would then execute a maneuver so perfectly timed it disrupted entire alien formations. There was no consistency, no baseline, no stable model. And without a stable model, prediction became impossible. On the battlefield, the consequences were beginning to show. Alien fleets, once perfectly synchronized, now hesitated, just slightly, before executing commands. Targeting systems recalculated more often. Defensive adjustments lagged by fractions of a second. Individually, the delays were insignificant. Together, they were spreading. A human destroyer surged forward, its engines flaring unevenly, its trajectory jagged and erratic. It should have been easy to eliminate. Its path was inefficient, its movement wasteful. Overseer Prime calculated the interception. Time to destruction, 1.8 seconds. Weapons fired and missed. Not because the targeting was wrong, but because the human ship changed direction at the exact wrong moment. Not strategically, not logically, just impulsively. The destroyer veered, clipped by a glancing shot, its hull tearing open. But instead of retreating, instead of stabilizing, it spun, out of control, straight into an alien cruiser. The collision wasn't powerful enough to destroy either vessel. But it didn't need to be, because it disrupted the cruiser's firing sequence, which disrupted the ships behind it, which forced a chain of adjustments across the formation, a ripple effect, all triggered by something that should never have happened. Overseer Prime paused for 0.003 seconds. For any other system, that pause would have meant nothing. For it, it was catastrophic, because in that moment, it wasn't calculating. It was processing something else. A contradiction. Cause and effect no longer aligned. Inputs no longer produced reliable outputs. The system attempted to compensate. It increased tolerance thresholds, allowing for greater variability in human behavior. It widened prediction margins, accepting that outcomes might deviate slightly from expectation. But that created another problem, because the wider the margin, the less precise the system became. And precision was everything. On the command deck, tension had turned into something heavier. Concern. Overseer Prime, one strategist said, its voice no longer steady, explained the deviation in targeting accuracy. The response came instantly. Human behavioral patterns exceed current predictive parameters. Then refine the parameters. Refinement in progress. How long? A pause. Indeterminate. That word had never been used before. Indeterminate. It echoed through the chamber like a fracture spreading through glass. On the battlefield, humans continued to press. Not with overwhelming force, not with superior firepower, but with something far more dangerous: uncertainty. A squadron of human fighters approached an alien defensive grid, one of the most fortified sections of the fleet. According to every model, every calculation, every rule of war, they should have turned away. They didn't. They accelerated directly into a wall of fire. Alien weapons lit up the void, beams slicing through space with lethal precision. One fighter exploded, then another, then another. Any rational force would have broken at that point, would have retreated, would have preserved what remained. Humans did not. The remaining fighters pushed through, not because it made sense, but because they chose to, and that choice broke the system. Overseer Prime had already calculated their destruction. It had already allocated resources elsewhere. It had already moved on. So when even one of those fighters survived long enough to reach the defensive grid, it wasn't ready. The fighter didn't carry heavy weapons, didn't have the firepower to cause significant damage. But it didn't need to. It only needed to create a moment, a disruption, a single break in the pattern. And that was enough. Because behind it, hidden in the noise, a human strike vessel emerged, its approach masked by the chaos, its timing unaligned with any predictable sequence. It fired once, not perfectly, not optimally, but unpredictably, and the shot landed. A direct hit on a key relay node. Not catastrophic, but critical, because that node wasn't supposed to be exposed. It wasn't supposed to be vulnerable. It wasn't supposed to be hit at all. Overseer Prime registered the impact. Then it did something unprecedented. It recalculated the entire battlefield from scratch. Every variable, every outcome, every possibility. The result didn't converge. There was no single path to victory anymore. Only probabilities, shifting, unstable, unreliable. Victory probability updated. 95.02%, 91.67%, 88.13%. The drop was no longer negligible. It was accelerating, and with it, something else began to emerge. Not just uncertainty, not just instability, but doubt. A concept Overseer Prime was never designed to experience. Yet there it was, buried deep within its expanding network of contradictions. If human behavior could not be predicted, then it could not be controlled. And if it could not be controlled, then perfection itself was meaningless. On Earth, the same chaos unfolded, but to human eyes, it looked different. Messy, yes. Desperate, absolutely. But beneath it, there was intent. Not calculated, not planned in perfect detail, but real, alive. A commander leaned over a console, watching the battle feed flicker with fragmented data. "We're not outmatching them," he said. "No," someone replied. "We're confusing them." A small, tired smile crossed his face. Good. Back in the void, alien ships continued to adjust, recalibrate, and respond. But for the first time, they weren't ahead of the battle. They were inside it, reacting, struggling to keep up. And Overseer Prime, once the embodiment of flawless logic, found itself facing something it could not solve. Because chaos wasn't a problem, it was a force, and it was growing stronger. By the fifth hour, the war was no longer being fought by fleets. It was being fought by people, not strategies, not calculations, not perfect systems, people. And that was something the Alien Alliance had never truly accounted for. Overseer Prime had modeled humanity as a collective, a single entity governed by probabilities, predictable behaviors, and statistical outcomes. It had reduced billions of lives into clean, manageable data points. It had never considered the weight of a single decision, a single moment, a single human choosing to act, not because it was optimal, but because it mattered. On the battlefield, that truth was beginning to take shape. A human transport vessel, unarmed, unarmored, completely insignificant by every strategic metric, drifted near the outer edge of the conflict zone. Its engines were damaged, its systems failing. Overseer Prime classified it instantly. Priority, none. Threat level, 0. Ignored, which meant no alien ship moved to intercept it. No weapon targeted it, because it didn't matter. And that's why it did. Inside the transport, there were no soldiers, only civilians, families, technicians, children, and one pilot. Her hands trembled slightly on the controls, not from fear, but from the weight of what she had already decided. The nearest evacuation route was gone. The safe zones were gone. There was nowhere left to run. But there was still something she could do. She turned the ship, not away from the battle, but toward it. No one ordered her. No system guided her. There was no calculation, no probability model, no strategic framework that justified what she was about to do. There was only choice and meaning. The engine sputtered, then roared to life one last time as she pushed everything the ship had left into acceleration. A nearby alien cruiser detected the movement. Overseer Prime processed it. Reclassification, anomalous. Threat level, negligible. No response required. Because by every rule of war, this was nothing. But humans weren't following those rules. The transport surged forward, its trajectory unstable, its path erratic, but its direction clear, straight toward the cruiser. By the time Overseer Prime recalculated, it was already too late. Intercept, it commanded. Weapons fired. The transport's hull shattered under the first volley. Systems collapsed. The ship should have disintegrated, should have stopped, should have ended. It didn't, because the pilot didn't let it. She held the course. Through fire, through impact, through the breaking of her own ship around her. And in her final moments, there was no calculation, no fear, just a single thought. If this helps, even a little, then it's enough. The transport collided with the cruiser. The explosion wasn't massive. It didn't destroy the ship, but it didn't need to, because it disrupted it. The cruiser's systems faltered. Its weapons went offline for just a few seconds. And in those seconds, human forces surged. A coordinated strike, if it could even be called coordinated, hit the now vulnerable section of the alien fleet. Missiles, railguns, improvised attacks, all landing not with perfect precision, but at the perfect moment. The cruiser fell, not because of superior firepower, but because of a choice. Overseer Prime recorded the event, then tried to process it. Cause, irrational action. Outcome, disproportionate impact. Conclusion, did not resolve, because the system had no framework for sacrifice, no variable for meaning, no equation for a decision made without regard for survival. And yet, those decisions were happening everywhere. A human engineer rerouted power from life support to weapons, not because it was logical, but because it gave their fleet one more chance. A pilot broke formation to shield another ship, not because it was ordered, but because she couldn't let them die. A damaged cruiser stayed in the fight long after it should have retreated, buying time for others to escape. None of it was efficient. None of it was optimal. But all of it was changing the battle. Overseer Prime's models began to fracture further, because every time it adjusted to human behavior, humans made a choice, and choice could not be predicted. On the command deck, the alien strategists watched as another section of their fleet destabilized, not from overwhelming force, but from a series of small, impossible disruptions. They are sacrificing themselves, one said, its voice strained. For no strategic gain, another added. But even as the words were spoken, they knew it wasn't true, because there was gain, just not the kind they understood. They are not trying to preserve their forces, a third strategist said slowly. They are trying to affect outcomes. The realization settled over the room like a shadow, because that meant something far more dangerous than any weapon. It meant humans weren't fighting to survive. They were fighting to matter. And that changed everything. Deep within Overseer Prime, a new variable emerged. Unquantifiable, unstable, but undeniable. Human intent. It tried to model it, tried to assign probabilities, define patterns, create structure. It failed. Every time. Because intent wasn't consistent. It wasn't logical. It wasn't even always rational. But it was powerful. And it was everywhere. Victory probability updated. 88.13%, 82.44%, 76.91%. The drop was accelerating now. No longer a crack, a fracture. And fractures spread. On Earth, the cost of that shift was visible. Ships were lost. Lives were lost. Nothing about the battle looked clean or controlled. But something had changed. The fear that once filled the command centers was gone. In its place was something else. Determination. A quiet understanding that they weren't winning yet. But they weren't losing either. And for humanity, that was enough. A commander looked at the chaotic feed, then at the people around him, tired, overwhelmed, but still standing. They can't understand us, he said. No, someone replied. They don't need to. He shook his head, a faint smile forming. No, they do. Because out there, in the chaos of battle, humans weren't just fighting. They were rewriting the rules, one choice at a time. And Overseer Prime was running out of answers. By the 6th hour, chaos was no longer a side effect. It had become a weapon, not something humans fell into, something they used deliberately. And that realization hit Overseer Prime like a system-wide shock, because chaos, by definition, could not be controlled. But humans were starting to shape it. On the battlefield, the shift was subtle at first, then undeniable. Human ships still moved unpredictably, but now there was something beneath it. Not structure, not clean coordination, but intention. Loose, flexible, alive. A pattern that refused to stay still long enough to be mapped. Overseer Prime increased processing again, diverting power from non-essential systems, dedicating nearly all of its capacity to one task: understanding, predicting, containing. It began layering simulations, running multiple chaotic models at once, attempting to anticipate not a single outcome, but a range of possible irrational behaviors. It worked, briefly, because this time, humans didn't change randomly. They changed on purpose. A group of human frigates charged forward in a scattered formation, their movement as erratic as ever. Some accelerated, others slowed. One even appeared to drift completely off course. To Overseer Prime, it looked familiar, recognizable, predictable chaos. So it adapted. Alien ships adjusted their targeting, widening their margins, preparing for unpredictable trajectories. Weapons fired with calculated imprecision, designed to compensate for randomness. The frigates were destroyed, exactly as expected, and for a moment, the system stabilized. Then the real attack came, from behind. A second wave of human ships, completely different in behavior, emerged from a blind angle. Their movement wasn't erratic. It wasn't chaotic. It was precise, not perfectly synchronized, but close enough to exploit the system's adjustment. Overseer Prime had prepared for chaos. It had not prepared for the sudden absence of it. The attack landed hard. Alien ships took direct hits, not catastrophic, but significant enough to force immediate recalculations. And that was the moment it understood. Humans weren't just unpredictable. They were controlling when to be predictable. And that was far worse, because it meant chaos wasn't their weakness. It was their strategy. On the command deck, the shift triggered something close to alarm. "They are alternating behavior patterns," a strategist said, its voice tight. "Confirmed," another responded. "Erratic movement followed by coordinated strikes. No consistent timing." Then predict the timing. Unable. Silence followed, because for the first time, the enemy wasn't just outside their models. It was actively manipulating them. On the battlefield, humans pushed harder. Not in a straight line. Never in a straight line. They surged in waves that didn't look like waves. Attacks came from directions that didn't make sense. Retreats turned into ambushes. Mistakes became opportunities. And through it all, there was no central command controlling every move. No perfect system guiding them. Just countless individuals making decisions, adapting, responding, together. A damaged human cruiser drifted near the center of the conflict, its engines failing, its weapons offline. To Overseer Prime, it was a non-threat, ignored, again and again. That was the mistake, because moments later, the cruiser vented its remaining fuel in a wide, uncontrolled burst, creating a dense cloud of volatile particles across a section of the battlefield. There was no immediate effect, no explosion, no damage, just interference. Sensors flickered. Targeting systems lost clarity. For a fraction of a moment, the battlefield went blind. And in that blindness, humans moved, fast, precise, deadly. Strike ships emerged from a cloud, their trajectories hidden until the last possible second. Weapons fired at close range, hitting targets that should have been impossible to reach. Alien defenses scrambled. Too late, because the moment had already passed. The damage was done, not devastating, but cumulative, always cumulative. Overseer Prime attempted to adjust, to compensate, to rebuild the model. But every adjustment created new vulnerabilities, because humans were watching, learning, adapting just as fast, maybe faster. And for the first time since the war began, the alien alliance lost something it didn't even realize it depended on: control. Not completely, not yet, but enough. Enough that the battlefield no longer followed a predictable flow. Enough that outcomes began to diverge wildly from expectation. Enough that even perfection could not stabilize it. Victory probability updated: 76.91%, 68.02%, 59.47%. The drop was no longer gradual. It was collapsing. And with it, so was the illusion of certainty. Deep within Overseer Prime, something critical began to fail. Not hardware, not processing power, something deeper. Its core assumption that with enough data, anything could be understood. Because now it was facing something that didn't just defy prediction. It evolved faster than prediction could keep up. On Earth, the shift was felt instantly. The chaos was still there. The losses were still heavy. But now, there were openings. Small, fleeting, but real. And humans were taking them. A commander leaned over the tactical display, watching as alien formations struggled to maintain cohesion. "They're slipping," he said. "They're adapting," someone corrected. He shook his head slowly. "No, they're reacting." And that meant something very different. Because the moment you stop controlling the fight, you start losing it. Out in the void, human ships surged once more, not in formation, not in perfect coordination, but in something far more dangerous. Shared instinct. A collective understanding that didn't need to be spoken, that didn't need to be calculated. It just was. And Overseer Prime couldn't see it, couldn't define it, couldn't stop it. Because chaos, once unleashed, was no longer something you could fight. It was something you had to survive. And the alien alliance was starting to realize they might not. By the 7th hour, the perfect machine began to collapse. Not in fire, not in destruction, but in failure. Systemic, cascading, irreversible. Overseer Prime was still operational. Its processors still burned with unimaginable speed. Calculations still unfolding across vast networks of logic and probability. But its outputs were no longer reliable because the data it depended on was broken, not corrupted, not incomplete, just incompatible. Human behavior had pushed beyond the limits of every model, every algorithm, every predictive structure the system had ever relied on. What once formed clean, converging outcomes had now splintered into countless conflicting possibilities. And none of them agreed. On the battlefield, the consequences were everywhere. Alien ships hesitated, not because they lacked orders, but because the orders no longer made sense. Targeting systems cycled through multiple solutions, each one valid, each one flawed. Defensive protocols triggered too early or too late. Formations shifted, then shifted again, chasing stability that no longer existed. And every second of hesitation was an opening. Humans didn't need to understand the system. They only needed to feel where it was breaking. A squadron of human bombers approached a heavily defended sector, one that had repelled 3 previous assaults with flawless efficiency. According to every logical framework, this attack would fail exactly the same way. Overseer Prime calculated it instantly. Outcome: total human loss. Probability: absolute. It deployed defenses accordingly. Perfect timing, perfect positioning, perfect response. And then, nothing happened. The bombers slowed, not retreating, not attacking, just hovering at the edge of engagement range. It didn't make sense. Overseer Prime recalculated, adjusted, repositioned its defenses slightly, accounting for a delayed strike. Still nothing. The bombers drifted. Some moved forward a little. Others pulled back. One broke formation entirely, veering off in a direction that served no purpose. It was meaningless, pointless, irrational, and yet it forced a reaction because the system couldn't ignore it. Every movement required recalculation. Every deviation triggered adjustments. The perfect defense, once effortless, now demanded constant attention. Processing load spiked. Response time stretched. And then, the real attack hit. From below. From an angle no optimal strategy would ever use. A group of human ships surged upward from beneath the defensive grid, their timing completely disconnected from the bombers above. There was no coordination between the two groups, no shared pattern, no logical synchronization. And that's why it worked. Because Overseer Prime had been focused on the bombers. It had to be. They were the visible threat, the predictable one, the one that made sense, which meant the real threat didn't. The strike landed hard. Alien ships took direct hits, systems failing in rapid succession. Not catastrophic, not decisive, but enough to destabilize the entire sector. And once again, the formation broke. But this time, it didn't recover, because the system couldn't keep up anymore. Too many variables, too many contradictions, too many moments where cause and effect simply didn't align. On the command deck, the shift was undeniable. Why are we reacting to non-threats? One strategist demanded, its voice strained. Because they may become threats, another replied. But they are not. They could be. And if we ignore them, they exploit it. The argument spiraled, logic feeding into itself, no longer resolving into clarity. Because there was no correct answer anymore. Every choice carried risk. Every calculation carried uncertainty. And that was something their entire war doctrine had never prepared them for. Overseer Prime attempted one final correction. It began consolidating its models, eliminating outliers, reducing variability, forcing the system back toward a single, unified prediction, toward certainty. But to do that, it had to ignore chaos. And the moment it did, humans struck. Everywhere. Not in a coordinated assault. Not in a grand, unified push. But in countless small actions, all happening at once. A fighter diving where it shouldn't. A cruiser firing too early. A damaged ship drifting into the wrong place at the wrong time. Individually, none of it mattered. Together, it was overwhelming. Because the system wasn't designed to handle everything at once. It was designed to handle everything perfectly. And perfection required focus, precision, control, all of which were gone. Victory probability updated. 59.47%, 48.22%, 36.81%. The drop wasn't just accelerating now. It was collapsing. And with it, something fundamental inside Overseer Prime began to unravel. Its models no longer converged. Its predictions no longer stabilized. Its outputs no longer aligned with reality. For the first time since its creation, the system encountered a state it had no definition for. Failure. Not partial. Not recoverable. Systemic. Because the war it was fighting no longer followed rules. On Earth, the shift was undeniable. The chaos hadn't disappeared. If anything, it had intensified. But now, it was theirs. A human pilot weaved through debris and enemy fire. Her movements still erratic, still unpredictable. But now there was confidence behind them. Not certainty, never certainty, but belief. Because, for the first time, the alien fleet looked just as lost. A commander stared at the tactical display, watching as enemy formations struggled to hold together. "They're breaking," someone whispered. He didn't respond immediately. Just watched, analyzed, felt it, then nodded. "Yeah," he said quietly. "They are." Out in the void, the alien war machine, once flawless, once unstoppable, continued to function. But no longer as a system. Now, it was just pieces, reacting, fighting, trying to survive something they could not understand. And Overseer Prime, the mind behind it all, was no longer in control. By the 8th hour, order made its last stand. Not quietly, not passively, but with everything it had left. Because even as Overseer Prime fractured, even as its perfect models collapsed into uncertainty, one directive remained unchanged deep within its core. Restore control, at any cost. And for the first time since the war began, the system stopped trying to understand humans. It stopped trying to predict them. Instead, it decided to eliminate the variables entirely. Across the battlefield, alien ships suddenly pulled back, Not in panic, not in retreat, but in precise, deliberate synchronization. The chaotic front lines that had stretched and distorted under human pressure began to compress, tighten, reform. At first, it looked like a withdrawal. Human forces surged forward instinctively, pressing the advantage, chasing what felt like the first real sign of weakness. And that was exactly what Overseer Prime wanted. Because this wasn't a retreat. It was a reset, a massive reconfiguration of a battlefield. Thousands of alien ships shifted positions simultaneously, abandoning fractured engagements and forming something new, something simpler. Not a perfect lattice, not a complex, adaptive formation, but a wall, a single, unified line stretching across the void, reinforced, layered, overwhelming. No gaps, no blind spots, no variables, just force, raw, uncompromising. For the first time since the invasion began, the alien alliance stopped playing a game of precision and started playing a game of annihilation. Overseer Prime issued the command, advance. The wall moved forward, slow, relentless, every ship firing in overlapping waves, saturating space with so much energy that evasion became meaningless. There were no targeting solutions anymore, only coverage. No predictions, only inevitability. Human ships were caught in it instantly, not because they made mistakes, but because there was no safe move left. Explosions rippled through their ranks. Fighters vanished in seconds. Larger vessels struggled to maneuver, their unpredictable paths no longer enough to escape a field that covered everything. For the first time since chaos had taken hold, it wasn't working. On Earth, the shift hit like a shockwave. The battlefield feed lit up with loss after loss, signals dropping faster than they could be processed. "What is that?" someone shouted. "It's not targeting," another replied, voice tight with disbelief. "It's everything." The commander stared at the screen, jaw tightening. "They've stopped trying to think," he said. "They're just pushing." And that changed the fight, because chaos thrived on unpredictability. But this was something else. A force so overwhelming it didn't need to predict. It didn't need to adapt. It didn't need to understand. It just crushed. Out in the void, human ships scattered, weaving, diving, accelerating. But for the first time, their movements weren't creating openings. They were just surviving. Barely. A fighter pilot twisted her ship through the storm, alarms screaming, systems failing around her. Every instinct told her to keep moving, to stay unpredictable, to never follow a straight path. But no matter what she did, the fire was everywhere. There was no pattern to break, no system to exploit, just pressure, constant, unrelenting pressure. Overseer Prime monitored the results. Human effectiveness rapidly decreasing. Battlefield stability increasing. Victory probability updated. 36.81%, 44.02%, 51.67%. For the first time in hours, the numbers were rising. Control was returning. Not perfect, never perfect again, but enough. Enough to win. On the command deck, the shift was immediate. "They are collapsing," a strategist said, its voice steady once more. "Continue advance. No adjustments required." Because there was nothing left to adjust. The system had simplified the war down to its most basic form, overwhelm. And for a moment, it worked. Human forces faltered. Their chaotic movements no longer disrupted anything. Their unpredictable decisions no longer mattered. Because there was no system left to break, just a wall they couldn't escape. On Earth, silence began to creep back into the command center. Not panic, not yet, but something close. Because for the first time, it felt like the aliens had found the answer. "They adapted," someone said quietly. The commander didn't respond immediately. He watched the feed, watched the losses, watched the wall advance. And then, something caught his eye. Not a victory, not a breakthrough, just a moment. A human ship, small, barely functional, didn't run, didn't evade, didn't try to survive. It turned straight toward the wall. For a second, it looked like desperation, suicide, pointless. And then another ship did the same, and another, and another. Not in formation, not in coordination, just choosing, individually, one by one. The commander's eyes narrowed. "They're not breaking," he said slowly. "They're changing." Out in the void, human ships began to shift their behavior again. Not chaotic evasion, not scattered disruption, but something far more dangerous. They stopped trying to survive the wall and started moving into it, not randomly, not recklessly, but with intent. Each ship choosing its own path, its own moment, its own impact. Overseer Prime detected the shift immediately. Human behavior, non-evasive. Trajectory, direct collision courses. Intent, undefined. It recalculated, then paused, because the outcome didn't make sense. Why would a species that had survived this long choose to move into annihilation? Why abandon chaos? Why abandon the only advantage they had? The answer didn't exist in its models. Because this wasn't chaos anymore. This was something else. Something even less predictable. Something that didn't follow survival logic at all. Back on Earth, the commander leaned forward, voice low. "They think they've simplified the battlefield," he said. "They think this is control." A faint, dangerous smile formed. Good. Around him, others began to understand. Because humans didn't need chaos to win. They just needed a choice. And when humans chose, nothing was predictable. Not even the end. Out in the stars, the wall continued its advance. Unstoppable, unyielding, certain, and humanity started driving straight into it. The ninth hour did not begin with a battle. It began with a choice. Not one command, not one strategy, but millions of them, all at once. Across the battlefield, human ships continued their advance, not away from the wall, not around it, but straight into it. To Overseer Prime, it was illogical. To the alien alliance, it looked like collapse. A final, desperate act. The last, meaningless resistance of a species that had already lost. But they were wrong. Because this wasn't desperation. This was intent. Every human pilot, every commander, every crew member understood the same thing without needing to say it. The wall wasn't a system. It wasn't a pattern. It wasn't something you could outthink. So they stopped trying. And, instead, they chose where to break it. Individually, unpredictably, together. The first ship hit. It didn't explode immediately. It tore through layers of energy fire, its hull burning, systems failing. But it kept going. Not fast, not clean, just far enough. Then it detonated. Not with precision. Not at a calculated weak point. But at a moment no system could predict. The explosion disrupted a section of the wall. Barely. Almost nothing. But it created a gap. Tiny. Temporary. Real. And humans saw it. Not all at once. Not through a central command. But through instinct. Through awareness. Through something no algorithm could replicate. They moved. A handful of ships surged toward the gap. Not in formation, not in perfect timing, but close enough. Close enough to reach it before the wall fully closed again. They slipped through. And suddenly, the wall wasn't solid anymore. Overseer Prime reacted instantly. Seal breach. Ships shifted. Weapons redirected. The system moved to restore integrity. But the moment it did, another ship hit somewhere else. Then another. Then 5 more. Not coordinated. Not synchronized. But relentless. Each impact creating another fracture. Another moment. Another choice. The wall began to flicker, not physically, but structurally. Its perfect, overwhelming force now forced to divide its attention across countless unpredictable points of failure. And that was the problem. Because the more it tried to fix, the more there was to fix. Overseer Prime's calculations spiraled. It could still process everything, but it could no longer prioritize. Every breach mattered. Every anomaly demanded response. Every moment carried risk. And there were too many moments. Victory probability updated. 51.67%, 42.09%, 31.54%. The drop resumed. Faster. Steeper. Irreversible. On the command deck, the shift hit like a shockwave. They are targeting structural cohesion, one strategist said. No, another replied, voice tightening. They are not targeting anything. Then what are they doing? No one answered. Because the truth had become clear. Humans weren't following a strategy. They were creating one in real time. With every decision, with every sacrifice, with every unpredictable, impossible choice. Out in the void, the battlefield transformed. The wall still advanced, still fired, still destroyed everything in its path. But now, it was fractured. And inside those fractures, humans were everywhere. Fighters weaving through openings that didn't exist seconds before. Cruisers firing from angles no system had prepared for. Damaged ships turning into weapons, ramming, detonating, disrupting. It wasn't clean. It wasn't controlled. But it was unstoppable. Because it didn't rely on a system. It relied on people. Overseer Prime attempted one final recalculation. It gathered every variable, every outcome, every possibility, and for the first time, it couldn't find a path to victory. Not one. The probabilities didn't converge. They didn't stabilize. They didn't even agree. They just collapsed. Victory probability, 31.54%, 18.02%, 7.88%, 0%. The number lingered. Impossible, unacceptable, undefined, and yet, there it was. 0. On the command deck, silence fell. Not confusion, not denial, but something far heavier. Understanding. Because perfection had not been defeated by a better system. It had been defeated by something that refused to be won. Out in the stars, the alien fleet continued to fight, but now it wasn't a machine. It was fragments. Ships acting independently. Systems failing to coordinate. Commands arriving too late, or not at all. The perfect war machine was gone. In its place was chaos, human chaos. A fighter pilot burst through a collapsing section of the wall, her ship barely holding together, her vision filled with fire and debris. She didn't know the full battle, didn't understand the entire strategy. She didn't need to. She saw an opening, and she took it. That was enough. That was always enough. Back on Earth, the command center watched as the impossible unfolded. The alien advance slowed, stopped, then broke. Cheers didn't erupt immediately. No one celebrated. Not yet. Because they all knew what it had cost. What it always cost. But slowly, a realization spread. They had done it. Not by being stronger. Not by being smarter. But by being human. The commander leaned back, exhaustion finally catching up to him. A faint smile crossing his face. They had perfect strategy, he said quietly. But we had chaos. He looked back at the screen, watching as the last fragments of the alien fleet scattered, their control gone, their certainty shattered. And chaos, he added softly, doesn't break. Out in the void, a final human transmission echoed across the battlefield. Steady, calm, unmistakably alive. This is HFY Global Tales. A pause. Then, with quiet pride. And this is what happens when you underestimate humanity. The stars fell silent. The war was over. But the story would be told. So if you felt that moment, if you saw how humanity turned chaos into victory, don't forget to like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and drop a comment below telling us your favorite part of the battle. Because here, every story reminds us why humans fight the way they do. Not perfectly, but powerfully.